on the third morning after the burial, when the frost still silvered the long grass at the foot of the churchyard wall, the most feared man in 3 counties knelt in the mud of a pauper's plot and let his shoulders break. There was no one to perform for. The sexton had gone in to his breakfast. The yew trees held their black water and said nothing. The Earl of Renholt, whom grown men crossed a room to avoid, whom debtors named in their prayers the way other men named the fever, knelt at a low, unmarked mound, with his bare hands flat against the cold earth, and he wept the way a child weeps, without dignity, without a glove pressed to the eyes, without the smallest care for who might come through the lych gate and see, Honor Westcott saw. She had come up the lane with a basket of dried rosemary to lay on the grave, because the woman beneath it had taught her that rosemary was for remembrance, and that the dead were owed it, whatever the parish could afford, and she stopped where the wall turned, and she did not breathe. She had served at the great house only 11 weeks. She had been warned of him on her first night, in the kitchen, in the careful low voices the servants used when they spoke of their master at all. The Iron Earl, the upper housemaid, had called him. A man with frost in the place his heart should sit. Do not look at him directly, the cook had said. Do not let him notice you. And here he was, noticed by her and not knowing it, with his fine dark coat dragging in the churchyard mud, sobbing over the grave of a still-room servant the world had buried without a stone. Some griefs are not meant to be witnessed, and she had learned in a life with little else to teach her how to make herself small and silent and gone. She waited, and she listened to a man unmaking himself over a heap of frozen earth, and she understood, before she understood anything else about Hartfell Court, that everything the household believed about the Earl of Renholt was a wall built over something, and that the something underneath had a name, and the name was carved nowhere because the parish would not carve a stone for a servant. The name was Mercy. Mercy Loxwell. The woman who had held the still-room keys at Hartfell for 40 years, and who had been put in the ground without so much as a board to mark her. To understand why the most feared man in England wept that morning, one must go back nearly 30 years, to a boy who was not yet feared by anyone, who was, in point of fact, afraid of nearly everything. He had not been born to the title. That was the first thing the county forgot when it began to fear. Him Damon had been a third son, a spare to a spare, raised in the cold east rooms of Hartfell, while his father lavished what little warmth he possessed upon the air. The old Earl had been a hard man with a riding crop and a colder temper, and the boy Damon, slight and watchful and prone to a stammer that the household took for stupidity, had learned early that a closed door was the safest thing in the world. His mother had died when he was 6. His brothers learned to be cruel because cruelty was the only currency the house respected, and they spent it freely on the smallest of them. It was Mercy Loxwell who found him the winter he was 9, locked out in a kitchen yard in his shirt-sleeves because his eldest brother had thought it amusing to bar the nursery door. She was not a young woman even then. She had come to Hartfell as a girl to learn the still-room, and she had stayed, and she ruled her domain of drying herbs and glass jars and copper pans with a quiet that the family found beneath their notice. She found the boy blue-lipped at the well, and she did not run for a footman, and she did not lecture, and she did not fear the consequence of a servant taking a young master into her own warm room against every rule of the house. She wrapped him in a horse blanket that smelled of lavender and wood smoke, and she sat him by her fire, and she put a cup of something hot and bitter into his shaking hands, and she said the words that he would carry for the rest of his life. "You are not nothing," she told him. "Whatever they have taught you in this house, that is the lie of it." He had not believed her. Even so, he had come back. Night after night that winter, when the house had gone to sleep and the cruelty with it, the boy crept down the servants' stair to the still-room, and Mercy Loxwell let him in. She taught him the names of the herbs because he liked the order of names, the way each thing had its proper place and use. She taught him to grind dried feverfew with a marble pestle and to read the color of an infusion. She did not pity him, which was the great gift, because pity would have confirmed everything his brothers said. She simply treated him as a person of worth, evening after evening, until he half believed it himself. And the stammer eased in her presence the way a clenched hand eases in warm water. What changed him, the county believed, was the deaths. 2 brothers and a father carried off inside 4 years by a fever that swept the low country and did not trouble itself with rank. The slight, stammering third son became, at 23, the Earl of Renholt, master of Hartfell and of estates in 2 other counties, and a fortune in funds and mortgages that he proceeded to manage with a cold brilliance that frightened older and harder men than himself. He foreclosed where his father would have forgiven. He won at the courts of Chancery, where his father would have settled. He buried softness so deep that the world forgot he had ever owned any, and the world, which loves a simple story, decided he had been born of ice. Only one person at Hartfell knew otherwise, and she kept his still room, and she never once curtsied lower than she meant it. And she alone in all of England was permitted to call him by the name his mother had given him. Honor learned all of this slowly, the way one learns the shape of a dark room, by touching its edges. She had not been hired to learn anything. She had been hired because the still room at Hartfell had stood locked for 2 months, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Anstruther, did not trust the undermaids near 40 years of Mercy Loxwell's tinctures, and the great ledger of receipts in which the old woman had written every preparation in a hand grown spidery with age. Honor had references from a physician's household in the next county, and a knowledge of simples uncommon in a girl of 23, and she had something else besides, which Mrs. Anstruther noticed on the first day and could not name. She was not afraid of the work, and she was not afraid of the dead woman's room, and when she found the great leather book she did not see clutter and superstition, she saw a life. The first time the Earl came to the still room, Honor did not know it was the Earl. She had her sleeves pushed back and her hands in a bowl of crushed comfrey, and a man stood in the doorway, and she said, without looking up, that he might wait. She would attend him directly. The room went very still. When she lifted her eyes, she saw a tall man in a dark blue coat, perfectly fitted, severe, with black hair gone iron gray at the temples, and a jaw set like a thing carved rather than born. His eyes were the gray of slate under rain. He was looking past her at the rows of glass jars, at the bunches of drying herbs hung from the beam, at the marble pestle worn smooth in its bowl, and his face, which the household swore had no expressions in it but contempt and indifference, was doing something Honor had no word for. He looked at the room the way a man looks at a house that is burned. "You have moved the feverfew," he said. His voice was low and level and gave nothing away. "I beg your pardon, my lord," Honor said, for she had guessed by then who he must be, and she set down her bowl and dropped the curtsy she had been too absorbed to drop. "I have only set it where the book directs." "The book?" he repeated. "Why?" She kept her book of receipts. Honor said, "I have been following it." He crossed the room then, and he took the great leather volume from its shelf, and he opened it, and Honor watched the Iron Earl turn the pages of a dead servant's recipes as though they were scripture. His thumb moved over a line of the spidery writing. He did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice had changed by some fraction so small that only a person who listened for a living would have caught it. "Leave the room as she kept it," he said. "Move nothing further." And he set the book down and went out, and Honor stood among the lavender and the comfrey, with her heart beating in her throat, certain she had glimpsed something she was not meant to glimpse, and certain, too, that she would say nothing of it to anyone in that gossiping kitchen below. She kept her word. The kitchen, however, had its own knowledge, and over the following weeks Honor gathered it. She learned that the Earl had paid for Mercy Loxwell's burial out of his own purse, and had stood at the graveside himself, which no master in living memory had done for a servant. She learned that he had ordered the still room kept, and a successor found, where any other gentleman would have cleared the room and been glad of the space. And she learned, from the cook who had been at Hartfell longest and feared the Earl least, that in 40 years Mercy Loxwell had been the only living soul permitted to speak to the master without an appointment, and that when she lay dying in the autumn, The Earl had cancelled his business in town and come north on the mail, and sat by her cot for 2 nights, and that the under-housemaid who carried up the broth had heard him, through the door, weeping like a man with no skin left. To the household, this was a marvel, and a thing to whisper over. To Honor, who had grown up in a foundling house and then in service and had learned the precise market value of being unseen, it was something else. It was the first crack she had ever found in the wall that the great and the cold built around themselves, and through the crack she saw a man who had been a frightened boy, and a servant who had refused to let him believe he was nothing, and a debt of love that the world's accounting had no column for. She found that she could not stop thinking of it. She told herself this was foolishness. A still-room maid does not think upon her master. The county feared him for excellent reasons, and a wise girl in a precarious place keeps her eyes on her own work. What she did not yet know was that her own work, and the small leather book, and the dead woman who had written it, were about to become the center of a quarrel that would set the whole county talking, and that the Earl of Renhold's frozen heart, once cracked, would not freeze over again so easily as everyone supposed. The quarrel had a name, and the name was the Dowager Countess of Crowhurst. She arrived at Hartfell in the 2nd week of December with 2 carriages, a lady's maid, a footman in livery, and a niece. The dowager had been a friend of the Earl's late mother, or had styled herself so, and she had taken it upon herself in the years since the fevers to be the one person in England who could speak frankly to the Iron Earl and live. The county half admired her for it. She arrived each winter, she installed herself in the best apartments, and she set about the project she considered her sacred duty, which was to see the Earl of Renholt married, his line secured, and his fortune kept within the families that understood its value. That she had a niece of marriageable age, well-born and well-dowered and not unhandsome, was, she would have told you, an entire coincidence. The niece was Lady Lettice Damerel, and she was not a cruel young woman, so much as a young woman who had been told her whole life that she was the correct answer to a question, and had never once been asked to consider that the question might not be hers to answer. She was fair and accomplished, and she played the pianoforte with a cold precision that the dowager called feeling. She had been brought to Hartfell 3 winters running, and 3 winters running the Earl had been distantly, immovably civil to her, and the dowager had gone away each spring more determined than before. This winter she meant to have it settled, and this winter, walking the corridors of Hartfell with a proprietor's eye, the Dowager Countess of Crowhurst noticed something that had not been there before. She noticed that the master of the house, who attended to nothing that did not concern his fortune, had given orders that a servant's room be kept untouched. She noticed that he walked on certain evenings toward the old kitchen wing, where a gentleman had no business to walk. And she noticed the new still-room maid, a quiet, clear-eyed girl with chapped hands and a steady look that the dowager found, in a servant, faintly insolent. The dowager made it her business to discover things. It was indeed the principal occupation of her widowhood. Within a few days she had learned the girl's name, her history, the foundling house, the lack of any family that could be named. She had learned of the Earl's visits to the still-room, and she had drawn from these threads the conclusion that her own world made available to her, which was that the master of Hartfell had taken an unsuitable interest in a nameless servant, and that the thing must be stopped before it became a scandal that touched the family and ruined the match. She began with a private word. She found Honor in the still-room on a gray afternoon, and she did not raise her voice, for her cruelty was never loud. "You are the new girl," she said, drawing off one glove finger by finger. "The foundling. I will give you some advice, which you may take or not, as you please. A clever servant knows the difference between being useful and being noticed. You have allowed yourself to be noticed. It will not end as you imagine. Men of his lordship's rank do not raise the women who keep their stores. They use them, and then they marry where the world expects, and the women they used are turned out without a character. Stay in this room, mind your jars. Do not mistake a master's whim for a future. And she drew the glove back on and went out. And Honor stood very still with the comfrey crushed under her hands, and understood that she had been issued a warning that was also a threat. That was the first voicing. The dowager had named her to her face, in private, and the name she gave her was a servant who did not know her place. Honor did not answer it. She had no answer that would not cost her the only situation she had. That night, she sat with a great leather book, and read again the receipts in the dead woman's hand. And she came upon a page near the back where the writing changed, where Mercy Loxwell had not written a receipt at all, but a kind of note to whoever should come after her. Honor read it 3 times. "Tend the master," the old woman had written, "though he will not ask it, and will not thank you. He was a good boy under a hard roof, and there is no one left who knew him so. The world will tell you he is iron. The world is a fool." And below that, a list of the small infusions she had made him over the years, for the headaches that came when he had sat too long over his accounts, for the cough he took each winter, for the nights he could not sleep. The last line read, "He takes chamomile and a little valerian when the old grief is on him. He will not tell you when the old grief is on him. You must watch his hands." Honor closed the book. She thought of the man in the churchyard, his bare hands flat on the frozen mound. She thought of the way his thumb had moved over the writing in this very volume. And she made a decision that a wiser servant would not have made, which was that she would honor the dead woman's last instruction. Whatever the dowager might think of it, the chance came sooner than she could have wished. The Earl took a chill, riding the home farm in the 2nd week of frost, and by the 3rd day it had gone to his chest, and the household, which feared him too much to manage him, fluttered uselessly while he refused his bed and sat gray-faced over his correspondence with a cough like a saw on green wood. Mrs. Anstruther came to the still room wringing her hands. He would not have the physician sent for. He would not stop working. The dowager had pronounced it a trifle, and gone to her cards. And Honor, who had nursed in a physician's house and knew the sound of a chest going wrong, did a thing that frightened everyone who heard of it afterward. She made up a preparation from the book, a draught of coltsfoot and honey, and a hot poultice of mustard and linseed, and she carried it herself up the great stair to the master's study. And she knocked, and when the cold voice told her to enter, she entered. He was at his desk. He looked, she thought, like a man holding himself upright by will alone. When he saw who it was, a flicker of something crossed his face. "You are not summoned," he said. "No, my lord," Honor said. She set the tray on the corner of his desk. She kept her voice level, the way she had heard him keep his. "You are unwell, and you will be worse by morning if that chest is not seen to, and you have forbidden the physician. So I have come instead." This is from her book. She kept the receipt for it on the 4th leaf. She made it for you, I think, more than once. He looked at the tray. He looked at the draught steaming in its cup, and something went out of him, some rigid thing in his shoulders, and for a moment the master of Hartfell was not a man any creditor need fear, but a sick man of 51 who had buried the only person who had ever cared whether he lived, and Honor saw his hands on the desk and remembered the old woman's words. You must watch his hands. His hands were not steady. "Sit," he said at last, not as a command, but as a man too tired to stand on ceremony. And she sat, and she made him drink the draught, and she set the poultice to his chest, with her own chapped hands and the cold formality of a nurse, and while it drew, she did not chatter, and she did not pity him. And the silence in the study was the first companionable silence that room had held in a year. When the cup was empty, he leaned back and closed his eyes, and after a while he said, without opening them, "You read her book." "Every night," Honor said. She wrote, "In the back," he said. "Did you read that too?" "I did, my lord." He was quiet so long she thought he had slept. Then he said, in a voice scraped down to nothing, "She found me half froze in the yard when I was 9 years old, and she would not let me believe what this house had taught me of myself." He opened his eyes. 42 years, and she never once let me forget it. There is not a soul left in the world who remembers I was ever a person." And he stopped, as though appalled at himself, and the iron came back down over his face like a portcullis. "You will not repeat what I have said." "No, my lord," Honor said. "Tread." And she gathered her tray and her empty cup, and at the door she paused, and she said the thing she had no right to say. She was the only one who remembered. Now there are two. She did not wait to see what his face did. She went down the stair with her heart going hard. The cough was easier by morning, and easier still the day after, and when the Earl came down at last, he sent for no one, and thanked no one, which Mrs. Anstruther took for ingratitude, and Honor understood for what it was. He did not know how to be thanked, because he did not know how to be loved, because in 1 in 50 years exactly one person had managed it, and she was in the ground beneath the churchyard wall with no stone to mark her. What followed could not be hidden, though both of them tried to hide it. The Earl began to come to the still room. Never long, never with any word that could be called improper, never closer than the width of the work-table. He would stand in the doorway in the early dark and watch her grind the herbs, and sometimes he spoke of the old woman, a memory, a winter, a thing Mercy had said. And sometimes he said nothing at all and only stood in the warm, lavender-scented room as a man stands in the one place in his house where he is not afraid. And Honor, who had spent her life unseen, found herself seen, and found that, being seen by this particular man, was a thing that made her hands unsteady at the pestle. And she told herself it was the strangest folly of her life, and she could not make herself stop. The dowager missed none of it. She struck in the open this time, at the worst moment she could have chosen, which was the evening of the county assembly. The Earl of Renholt did not, as a rule, attend the assembly. This year, to the astonishment of the neighborhood, he did, and a dowager believed she knew why, and she believed the why, had chapped hands and kept his still room, and she came armed. The great rooms above the assembly were full of the county's first families, the candles blazing, the musicians sawing through the country dances, Lady Lettuce in white at the pianoforte playing her cold, precise music while her aunt watched the door. And when the Earl arrived, severe and unsmiling in his dark blue coat, the dowager crossed to him through the press of people and said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that she had been meaning to congratulate him on the discovery of his new still-room maid. "Such a useful creature," she said, smiling. The room began to quiet around them the way a room quiets when it scents blood. "I am told you visit her often. I am told she nurses you. How fortunate that a foundling with no name and no family should find so generous a protector. The county will be most interested to learn how generous." That was the second voicing, and it was a public exchange, and it was meant to brand Honor before the whole neighborhood as the Earl's kept woman, and to brand the Earl as a fool ruled by his appetites, so that the only remedy left to a man of his pride would be to dismiss the girl at once and turn for safety to the white-gowned niece at the pianoforte. It was beautifully aimed. It would have worked upon any man the dowager had ever known. The Earl looked at her for a long moment, and the room held its breath, and the pianoforte faltered and stopped. And then he said, his voice level and carrying and quite without heat, that he found the dowager remarkably well informed upon the management of his household, and that he would relieve her of the burden of it. The still-room maid at Hartfell had nursed him through a putrid chest that the dowager herself had been pleased to call a trifle, and she had done it from a book of receipts kept by a woman who had served his family for 40 years, and whom that family had let into the ground without a stone. He bowed. Very slightly, he said he was going to remedy the want of the stone in the morning. He said he would be obliged if the county would direct its interest there. And he turned and left the assembly, and the Dowager Countess of Crowhurst was left standing in the silence she had made, having learned that the Iron Earl attacked did not flinch toward safety, but toward the thing he had decided to defend. The Dowager, however, did not collapse. That was the mistake the county made about her, and the mistake Honor very nearly made too. She had been confidently wrong her whole life, and her confidence did not crack at a single reverse. She went home from the assembly and she sat up the night. And she understood that the frontal assault had failed because the Earl's pride had taken Honor's part, and that she must, therefore, attack, not the girl's place in the house, but the girl herself, her right to be in any house at all. By morning she had written 3 letters. One went to a man of business in town who made his living discovering things about people who could not afford to have things discovered. The other 2 went to parishes where a foundling girl named Honor had been bound out to service before she came north. It took the better part of a fortnight, and in that fortnight a strange peace lay over Hartfell. The Earl had a stone cut. He chose the words himself, and showed them to no one but Honor. In the still room, holding the mason's paper in his 2 hands, Mercy Loxwell, it read, 40 years in this house. She was not nothing, and neither was the boy she saved. Honor read it and could not speak, and the Earl folded the paper and said gruffly that he supposed it was a strange thing to carve on a servant's stone, and Honor said it was the only true thing she had ever seen cut into any stone. And for a moment they stood in the lavender-smelling dark, and were simply 2 people who had loved the same old woman. And the width of the work table between them felt like the only honest distance in England. Then the dowager's man of business sent his report, and the peace broke. She chose the morning the new stone was set. The Earl had ordered it, and half the household walked down to the churchyard to see it, and Honor stood at the graveside with her basket of rosemary. And the dowager arrived in her carriage, with a paper in her gloved hand, and the look of a woman about to be proved right at last. She did not wait for privacy. She had a witness with her, the rector, whom she had invited along on a pretext, and she meant the thing done before the household and the church and God. She said loudly, into the cold churchyard air, that before his lordship sentimentalized any further over the help, the county had best know the truth of the girl he was protecting. The foundling Honor Westcott, she said, had been turned out of her last place under a clout. There had been a theft. A silver caddy and a quantity of laudanum missing from a physician's house, and the still-room girl dismissed without a character, and only a forged reference between her and the gutter. Here was the proof. A sworn statement, taken at the dowager's expense from the physician's housekeeper. That was the 3rd voicing, the witnessed third-party report. And it was the cruelest, because it was time to the unveiling of the stone, in the very place where the Earl's grief was most exposed, and because it was not merely an insult now but an accusation that could see Honor transported, or worse. The household drew back from her. Honor saw it happen, the small movement of feet on the frozen grass, the faces turning. She had felt it before, the world stepping away, and she had thought herself hardened to it, and she found she was not. She looked at the Earl. His face had gone to stone, the old iron mask come down whole, and for one black moment she believed the dowager had finally found the lever, that he would look at her now as the world looked at her, as a thing to be stepped away from, and that the warmth of the still room had been a dream she had let herself have above her station. She might have wept. She did not. She thought of the old woman's writing in the back of the book. She thought of the man who carried that whole grief in his unsteady hands and would not let it be named. And she found, standing at the grave of Mercy Loxwell with the county drawing back from her, that she would not let the dead woman's last student be branded a thief in front of the dead woman's stone without saying one true thing. She turned to the dowager, and she did not raise her voice. And she said that the laudanum had not been stolen, it had been given. The physician's own daughter had been taking it in secret and growing ill upon it, and Honor had found her out, and had taken the bottles from her, and had gone to the physician with the truth, and the physician, to protect his daughter's name and his own, had dismissed the still-room girl, who knew it, and let the household believe the worst. The silver caddy she had never touched in her life. And if the dowager doubted it, Honor said, she had only to write to the physician's daughter herself, who was a married woman now in the next county, and might, in conscience, prefer the truth at last to a lie that had ruined an innocent girl. It was the honest, precise directness that the old voice in the book had described, the one sentence a person can only say when her values are struck, and it landed in the cold churchyard with the weight of plain truth. and it should have been enough on its own. Truth alone, though, has buried as many as it has saved, and honor knew it, and the dowager's smile told her the dowager knew it, too, a servant's word against a sworn statement. The accusation would stand, and the doubt would stand, and the girl would have to go, and the niece at the pianoforte would have her winter after all. And then the Earl of Renholt spoke, and the iron in his face was not the absence of feeling, but the most controlled feeling Honor had ever seen a man hold. He said that he had read the physician's daughter's letters. The whole churchyard turned to him. He had suspected, he said, when the new still-room maid came to him with a knowledge of simples beyond any foundling's training and a reference that did not survive his man of business's first inquiry, that there was a story behind her dismissal, and being a man who did not trust the absence of facts, he had sent to learn it. He had the correspondence in his study. The physician's daughter, pressed by her own conscience and by the prospect that an innocent woman might suffer for her, had written it all to Honor twice in the past year, begging forgiveness, and Honor had answered her with mercy and had never once used the letters to clear her own name, because to clear her own name would have ruined the woman who wronged her. He had the letters under his hand this fortnight. He had been waiting, he said, his gray eyes never leaving the dowager, to see whether the lie would come for her in the open, or only in the dark. And he was glad it had come in the open, because now the open could answer it. The Dowager Countess of Crowhurst stood in the churchyard with her sworn statement gone to so much paper in her hand, and saw, in a single clarifying instant, that she had not been outmaneuvered by luck or by accident, but by the fact that the girl she had taken for a nameless schemer had chosen mercy over her own safety. And watched over by the one man in England whose seeing reordered everything. The rector was looking at the dowager now and not at Honor. The household had stopped drawing back, and the dowager, who had been confidently wrong her whole life, felt the floor of her confidence give way, and she did the only thing left to a woman of her training, which was to fold, her gloved hand lowered. She said, in a voice that had lost its carrying edge, that she had been misinformed. She said it twice. I have been misinformed. I have been misinformed. And she stood among the gravestones smaller than she had ever been, displaced from the center of a world she had ruled by being certain. The Earl did not humiliate her further. He had won the thing he meant to win, and he was not a man who spent cruelty he did not need. He inclined his head to her, with a courtesy that was its own kind of dismissal, and he said only that he was sure the county would be glad to know the truth, and that he hoped the dowager would extend her congratulations to Lady Lettice, who deserved a kinder winter than the one her aunt had planned for her. And Lady Lettice, standing pale at the edge of the churchyard, looked at her aunt, and looked at the Earl, and looked last and longest at the still-room maid with the basket of rosemary, and something in her own arranged life came loose, and she gave Honor a small nod almost of gratitude, as a young woman might who has just understood that she has been spared a marriage she had never been asked whether she wanted. The public reversal was not yet finished, for the Earl had one more thing to say, and he had decided to say it in the churchyard, in the place where the hierarchy had rendered its verdict on the women of no name at the foot of the stone he had cut for one of them. He crossed the frozen grass to where Honor stood. The county watched. He stopped before her, not at the distance a master keeps from a servant, but the distance a man keeps from a woman, whose answer he means to wait for, and he said her name. Not Westcott, not the girl, nor the still-room maid, nor you. He said her given name, the first time he had ever said it aloud, and in his cold, level voice it came out like something thawing. Honor, he said. And then, after a beat of silence in which the whole churchyard could hear the wind in the yews and the distant low of the home farm, he spoke the line he had not spoken before and would not speak again, the words offered plainly in the arena where the world had judged her. Stay, be no servant in my house but my wife. Honor stood at the grave of the woman who had taught her that the dead are owed remembrance and that no one is nothing, and she understood that the old woman had given her a last gift after all, had left in the back of a leather book the instruction that had brought her up the great stair with a draught in her hands, and that everything which had grown between this cold thawing man and this nameless girl had grown from Mercy Loxwell's stubborn refusal 42 years ago to let a frightened boy believe the worst of himself. She could not speak at first. She looked at the stone. She looked at the man. And then she did the only thing that answered him, which was to set her basket of rosemary down upon the new grave and to put her chapped hand into his. And the most feared man in England closed his cold fingers around it as though it were the warmest thing he had ever held, and bowed his head and was not feared at all. They did not marry that winter. The Earl would not have the county say he had rushed a servant to the altar, and Honor would not be wed in a manner that let anyone call her grasping. And so they did the slow, proper thing, and the banns were read in the little church above the churchyard where Mercy Loxwell lay beneath her new stone, which loves a simple story and had been given a better one, came round in time, the way the cook had always said the county did. The Dowager Countess of Crowhurst went south in the spring and did not return, but she sent the following Christmas a short, stiff letter of correct congratulation, and Honor, who had learned mercy from a physician's daughter and remembrance from a still-room, and had no use for old grievances, answered it kindly. Lady Lettice married a clergyman of her own choosing 2 years later, and was, by every account, happier than her aunt had ever meant her to be. The wedding was small. Honor wore a gown of soft green that the Earl had ordered without asking her, having watched the way the old woman taught what color eased her, and she carried rosemary for remembrance, and a sprig of it lay afterward on the grave by the wall. The household stood in the church. Mrs. Anstruther wept and pretended she had not. The cook said to anyone who would listen that she had known the master had a heart in him all along, which was not true, but was the kind of thing that becomes true once a place has decided to love its people again. That night, the first night, there was no scene the world is owed a description of, and this story will give it none. There was only a great cold house grown warm in one wing, and a fire in the still-room grate, and 2 people who had each spent a life unseen sitting together in the lavender dark, where a boy had once been told he was worth the saving. The Earl held the great leather book in his lap. He turned to the page in the back, the writing in the old spidery hand, and he read it aloud, slowly. All of it, tend the master, though he will not ask it. The world will tell you he is iron. The world is a fool. And when he reached the last line, he takes chamomile and a little valerian when the old grief is on him. You must watch his hands. His voice failed him, and Honor took the book gently from his lap and finished the line for him. And then she watched his hands, which were not steady, and she put her own over them until they were. If you have stayed with this story to its end, perhaps you have known a Mercy Loxwell of your own, someone the world counted for nothing, who decided you were not nothing. And if you have, you will understand why the most feared man in England knelt in the churchyard mud. He had not wept for a servant. The county had that wrong, as the county had nearly everything wrong. He had wept for the only person who had ever found him worth the saving, and he had wept because he feared, with her gone, that he would forget how to be a man who could be saved. He need not have feared it. She had seen to that, in the back of a book, with a girl she would never meet, the way the truly good arrange for their kindness to outlive them and walk into rooms they will never enter. The stone is still there, above the churchyard wall, where the parish lays its poor. The grass grows long around it in the summer, and the frost silvers it in the winter. And on the anniversary of her death, every year, a man and a woman walk down the lane together, and the woman carries rosemary, and the man who once knelt in the mud of that plot alone and unmade, kneels now beside someone, and does not weep, and lays his hand flat upon the cold earth and says, under his breath, where only the woman beside him can hear that he is well, that he is loved, that he is not, after all, nothing. And the wind moves in the yews above the wall, and says nothing, and means everything, and the rosemary lies green against the grey stone, until the snow comes and covers it, and covers them, and covers all the small unmarked plots where the great forgot to cut a name, and the parish goes home to its fires, and Hartfield Court, that had been the coldest house in England, keeps its lamps lit late into the warm and ordinary dark.